Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Rare Book Room. My name is Emily Simpson. I'm one of the events directors here at Strand Bookstore. Tonight we have the pleasure of partnering with Bomb Magazine, which just had its 32nd anniversary, celebrating its dedication to contemporary art and literature. This partnership is the first of a series of conversations the Strand and Bomb will host together. For this evening, please welcome Rachel Kushner, whose new novel, The Flamethrowers, has been critically acclaimed by Vanity Fair and the New York Times. Rivka Galchen, the author of Atmospheric Disturbances and writing teacher at Columbia University, and Hari Kunzru, author of Gods Without Men, whose work has been translated into over 20 languages. Moderating this evening is celebrated poet and Bomb Magazine senior editor, Mónica de la Torre. Thank you for coming and please enjoy.
Thank you so much. Great. Okay, so I thought we'd start with a very, perhaps, easy icebreaker and an acknowledgement of the different
I'm nervous already.
You're nervous already? No. Yeah, an acknowledgement of the different points in your careers that you are in. Maybe careers is not the word that I want to use, but you're at different stages. Rachel, your book just came out. A book that I don't know when you finished, but there's probably a gap, a significant gap between the time in which you finished your book and it got published. Hari, your book came out last year, and Rivka, I know that you. I haven't written anything for a long time. I know that you're working on a short story collection, so I wanted to start by asking you what your experience of the temporal shifts and the displacements in the writing process are in terms of, can you speak about your work when it's in incubation process, for instance? Like, what is that like? At some point when you're done, you have to articulate a narrative that will be interesting for people, like the kind people here sitting at the audience. You come up with a narrative about the process, but perhaps it's not necessarily equal to the process itself, right? In saying, I mean, you're novelists, and so you have a flair for this, and probably in articulating that narrative about your process, there's some invention, perhaps, that can be very pleasant or revealing. So that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you about. And then also, what happens once you've talked about your work? Does it make you see it in a different light? And does it determine the writing that you're actually doing afterwards? If it makes any sense. Yeah? Okay. So.
Yeah, I thought I could talk about things in process, and I've really been sort of bitten in the arse by that lately. I seem to be pitching constantly. I don't know what's going on at the moment. I mean, part of it is that I'm actually doing some screenwriting, and you're forced to talk about everything all the time with people who don't really seem to share very much with you. So you're doing this kind of trying to reach your idea across a table. But there seems to be an increasing amount of that in the fiction publishing industry as well. And so I started something, and then was kind of happy to talk about it, and am now feeling that I've hollowed it out in some way by doing that. So I started something else, and I'm not talking about that. And it feels good, and it feels precious.
So you prefer not to talk about something that's in its early stages because you might jinx it?
A novel certainly takes so long, relatively. It has to be a project that you can live inside for a period of years, really. I mean, at least a couple of years. And so it has to be a machine which can somehow process all your stuff, all your experiences during that time in some way, even if it's in a very kind of oblique and coded way. And I think oversharing is a, you risk meaning that it doesn't function. I think there's something quite important. I'm quite interested in privacy in more general terms at the moment, and yes.
Should I go next? Okay. Yeah. Trying to think of where to begin with the questions. Everyone can hear, okay, right? Yeah. Well, yeah, my book, the first part, my I guess I finished my book in January, the new book, in January of 2012. So it feels like it was about a year ago. But after you finish a book for a publisher, you're still inside of a pretty endless process of copy editing and proofing and cover and et cetera, et cetera. So you're sort of, I feel like I was with the book in a continual way, basically until it came out, at which point I had to begin talking about it. And really the first interview, the first press of any kind that I did for this book was a conversation with Hari for Bomb magazine, and we did it by Skype because I live in Los Angeles, and I had gone through the whole media thing with my first book, learning how to, you kind of have to create a sort of discourse that then you utilize over and over again as you're asked questions, but that only happens through experience of doing it. Having done it before for a first book didn't at all prepare me to do the same thing for my second book. And when I did the interview with Hari, luckily he let me go back in and rewrite some of my answers. But I wasn't prepared at all.
I rewrote some of my questions. Let's be fair. We
right.
It's totally fake. What's on the the idea that that was our.
Well, writers construct in writing. I mean, it's hard to improvise, but when I was doing that, I felt like listening to Monica's question, I was thinking about like the first time I took the driver's test growing up, and they ask you to parallel park in San Francisco, and I failed it, and then you go back and eventually you learn how to drive. But with a book, even though all of the ideas in the book are mine, and I had total control over the novel, there's so many different things that go into writing a novel at different moments, and the temporality of it is protracted. I mean, the writing of it, such that when it comes time to give a kind of encapsulation of all your different thematic interests and the kinds of materials that were important to the book and that you care about, I forget sometimes, like, some of what inspired me, and I have to make cheat sheets. But then eventually you learn how to talk about your own book, and the frightening thing about that is that then it's like you can go on autopilot. And right now I'm on a book tour, and I feel like I could accidentally sell myself a pair of overpriced shoes or something, like, because I'm just used to doing the thing, because I've had to be on the radio and et cetera, where you can't revise it.
But isn't that the purpose of a book tour? It's to alienate you so much from the thing that you've written that you feel forced to write something else in order to feel good about yourself again.
Yeah, there's probably something to that. I mean, when I talk about a book, it's not, it's long written, and I've already moved on to the next book, which I wouldn't talk about. But part of that, I think, for me, is received wisdom. Like, I've looked at what other novelists have done, and it's always good to have examples and models, but it seems like I always read that authors will say, well, I'm not talking about that, because it's either bad luck or it deflates some of the, pneuma or whatever of the idea to leak it out. And I don't know if that's the reason why I don't. It just seems like if I could choose whether to do so or not, if there is any downside to mentioning it, then there's no reason to do so, because people will know about it when I'm finished. Hopefully.
And also, can everyone sort of hear, basically? Use the mic. All right. And also,
I like that robotic direction.
I don't know. I guess there's also the issue, like, it seems like you're often, like, choosing. I mean, when you, especially right now, you have to talk about your book again and again. You're choosing between being, like, I guess, sort of true and accurate to what you're doing, and being like a nice person who's like answering people's questions in a nice synoptic way. So it seems like a tension. So I imagine you start feeling like you're being, have a bit of a shtick, but the shtick is like the friendly thing to do. So you're sort of, it's a little bit of a bind.
I really admire writers who can not go along with that in some way, because I feel I'm dreadfully prone to just sort of taking whatever stupid question it is and trying to make something out of it, and and then you end up feeling like an ass at the end of it, and I like people who will just say, what a ridiculous thing to ask me, go away.
I do think, I don't know if I like those people or not, but I probably do, right? But I remember one of the best, most interesting author interviews I watched, although I think most people shouldn't do this, and none of us should probably do it, was Donald Antrim came and was being interviewed by Ben Marcus, and Ben Marcus would ask sort of long, thoughtful questions about his process or how he came up with the first sentence, and then Donald would just look at him and say, "No," or "I don't remember." And that was it. But it seemed honest. There was something honest, even though the uncomfortable silence in the room was just growing. Like, honest, I think the audience members wanted to answer on his behalf, just to cheer up the interviewer.
Poor Ben.
Poor Ben.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the process tends to be so chaotic and amorphous and different, right? It's not like there's one process. There's like all these micro processes. Sometimes you're really excited. You think you know where you're going. Sometimes that's actually the most dangerous writing, when you're so certain of what you're doing. Then you look back and you realize that that sentiment actually was just like your own projection, but it's not really there in the writing. So, I mean, again, speaking of projection, here I am projecting stuff onto you because I've never written fiction, and it's a totally different and fascinating process for me. But yeah, so Rivka, do you want to talk about what you're working on right now, or you'd rather not?
I guess not.
That's that then. We'll be signing.
Okay, next question. Repurposing, and maybe deploying skills that you've learned in other environments in order to perhaps convey more realism in the novel, or I mean, perhaps you just do it without even knowing that that's what you're doing. But I'm thinking, for instance, with your novel, Rachel, you are also an art critic, and your descriptions of artwork in your novel, and not only of artworks but of artists and particular scenes, are just so they're just so realistic, and they seem so believable that I often found myself wondering if it wasn't a roman à clef, if you were disguising actual artists under different names in the novel. So I'm just wondering, it seems like maybe you've done it too, Harry. You were a music editor, you wrote about technology, you're a journalist. So how, and in your case, Rivka, you're an MD in psychiatry. So how do those skills, is it deliberate that you bring those skills to the writing of a novel? And B, does it feel like you're repurposing something that belongs elsewhere? Does it feel slightly subversive, perhaps, that you're kind of taking what belongs in the realm of your day job and bringing it into the realm of fiction, for instance?
Everyone's looking at me.
Do you want us to go?
So I wanted to be a fiction writer before I wanted to do anything like write journalism. It was very accidental, for example, that I was a technology writer, because at a certain point in my early 20s, that turned out to be my only marketable skill, was knowing about the internet. And so I told people about the internet for money for part of the 90s. And actually, well, and then that did me. I was working for Wired magazine at the point when it was a sort of day-glow orange cult based in San Francisco, and they would send me off to talk to people who would tell me that the future was sort of being physically instantiated somewhere in the valley, and these extraordinary characters who were very alien to my way of thinking and my way of experience. I mean, I remember asking my boss, like, we're always writing about these wealthy kind of people who are making the future, so they tell us, and what about everybody else? Hasn't half the world not made a phone call? And I was told very sternly that there are no have-nots, there are only have-laters. And at that point I realized that everybody was insane, and I needed to write a novel about it. So I got given a lot of material from that, sort of by accident, really. But there's a fairly easy flow for me, but across the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction. I like doing journalism partly because it gets me out of the house, and I get to, I get to go and see other people doing whatever it is that they do. It's quite a relief not to be inside my own head, and yeah, you get a little window onto other kinds of life.
for me, every writer perhaps is different, but for me, the novel is a challenge that requires every aspect of myself, and thereby every single thing that I know about the world is going to be summoned in some way by whatever I'm working on. I think a lot of writers are like that, and I think across genre too. It's like Anne Carson, by no accident, will write about Monica Vitti or about Sappho. Well, she's a classicist. Not that Monica Vitti has to do with classicism, but I was just thinking about different things she's interested in, and then we'll incorporate into her poetry. And not at all to compare myself with Anne Carson. She's legitimately a classicist and has a job, etc. And I am not, legitimately anything really except for a fiction writer. I do write about art on occasion and have done so for many years now, but I don't really consider myself an art critic, like a tastemaker type of person, and nor am I an art historian, because I'm not trained that way. But I'm interested in contemporary art and culture, and so it's a kind of knowledge that I picked up in a semi-autodidactic but organic fashion after having been assigned various pieces by Artforum over the years. So when it came time to write this novel, it was no accident that I wanted to write a book that was partly set in the art world of downtown New York in the 70s, because it was something that I'd picked up a few ideas about just along the way. So putting those ideas into the book was appropriate, since the book was about the art world, but it's definitely not, at least I don't think of it at all as a roman à clef. Like, the characters are fictional, they're entirely constructed, but I do like the cameo. For me, it's sort of fun to place a real person in a scene and just have John Chamberlain like drunkenly move through the room, because he was there, and it just kind of could give a tiny registration for the reader to remind them that they're in a real space. But I try to actually downplay the art world in this novel, in the sense of it being artists who create actual works and then the descriptions of those works. I really kept that to a bare minimum, because I don't really think it works in fiction to do that. Like, I don't like to read novels about the art world when there's a long description about that person's conceptual artwork, and you can tell that the writer's making it up and kind of getting lost inside the reverie of this fictional stuff this person makes. For some reason, it comes across to me as precious. So I just tried to signify that these people make works, but not go too in depth into what they make. But yeah, I think writing sort of just, for me, it's part of the great fun and the challenge is that it kind of summons everything you know. But try not to be a little miss know-it-all. I'll end on that.
I was kind of curious about your process, because I know that a lot of what maybe was a kind of fuel for you were images, which I envy, because I'm always sort of wanting to feed off something that's not already in the language form, or certainly at least not already in the fictional literary language form, so that there's some other energy coming in. Was that intentional? What was that like? What were some of the images that were important to you while you were working?
What were some of the, well, yeah, I collected a lot of images while I was working on this new book, The Flamethrowers. I guess one of the first images that I put up was of a soldier from World War I riding a motorcycle that had a really crazy sidecar contraption on it that was shaped like a bullet. And there was another guy in the sidecar who looked like he was his sort of amanuensis. He had a little typing machine and was taking notes. And that sounds kind of precious, but the book is about the 70s, but I'm also interested in futurism and its relationship to war, and I'm interested in motorcycles and technology and the way that speed was introduced via war. And I found this image online and just put it up in my office. I did that with several images. The image that's on the cover of my book was another one that I just printed out. You can print things out on a black and white printer, they somehow look okay. And I put that up, and I had all kinds of images up on the wall while I was writing, stills from films. There's a film, the last film by Guy Debord, in Jerem Imis Nakti at Consummer Igni, has all these different stills that he uses in it. And then there would be the subtitled comment that Debord makes over the image. So in a way, that right there is a kind of crystallization of language and image that he put together. I think Debord was really masterly at doing that, at combining words and images, and a lot of that film is just like still image after still image with his commentary over it. And so I put those things up. I mean, there's a whole range of things that I worked with. But sometimes the image for me is also just an image in my mind. Like I was thinking about the blackout in New York City in 1977 and the, kind of hostility in the press to the looting and criminality that went on in New York. And then I was thinking about a march in Rome that same year, earlier, March 12th of 77, and thinking about crowds in the street who appear there by a certain precipitative, is that a word, logic, but in an unexpected manner. Like in New York, nobody knew the electricity was going to go off. And in Rome, nobody knew that a student was going to be killed by the police in Bologna the day before, which was what precipitated this outpouring of people to Rome who came from all over Italy. I was thinking about those two events, and to me, those are like images in a way. Like they have some similarity to them, but what is the similarity? I don't know. So,
I mean, I often have sort of several things that I know go together but don't rationally go together. And that can be the starting point for something. Like I have absolutely no idea why, I don't know why something, for example, from the last novel, why material about computer modeling and the stock market should be anything to do with the Mojave Desert, but they were. And then I have to write in order to find out what that connection is for me.
Did you look at a lot of images, like when you were doing the cult who are living out in the desert?
There's quite a good. There's a good book about. I think it's slightly tediously called Spaced Out, but it's a sort of utopian architecture in the 1960s, and that had a lot of visual references to Western United States communes. And I have a friend in San Francisco whose art practice revolves around a lot of that, and so she's always finding things online and was always sort of sending me pictures of people at Morningstar looking like they hadn't had a bath, kind of thing.
So did you print out the images and put them up in your office?
I'm trying to remember what I had up at that point, because I keep moving. I've moved around a lot in the last few years, and before that I definitely had that sort of thing of papering the walls of my office with my sort of projection of my book. But for the last about 2 years, the only thing I've had up in my writing space, it's a sort of gag, really. It's one of those it's one of Mao's speeches, which is published in those English translations as little Peking press pamphlets with the cream covers, and it's called Oppose Book Worship. So it just says Oppose Book Worship above my screen, and that feels like a useful thing to remind myself.
I feel like that methodology of not really being in control, of just you have a couple interests and they seem to sort of like sit on the surgical table together, whatever it is, the sewing machine and the umbrella, or what is that like in the composition process? Because I know in a sense, and it sounds like both of you, almost feel most in control if I'm not in control. I trust the not in control thing, but what does that make your kind of daily work like if you don't know exactly why you're interested in Italy in the 70s and New York in the 70s, or machines? Or you don't really know why. What does that make your daily process like to not be in control or not be pushing some predetermined theme? Or
Well, to me, like the work of the novel is to not be in control and to be moving at a patient pace toward some future that is not a foregone conclusion. Like I want there to be a certain quotient of mystery always when I'm writing. Maybe halfway through the book, I know how it's going to end, basically, and it's a matter of getting there, but there are still things that are going to happen that I haven't foreseen. But for me, the process of the novel, not that I have a ton of experience, I've only written 2 of them, but with the second one, the process of the novel and the challenge of it was partly to figure out how these two realms were related, and I didn't want them to over-relate in a very reducible and clean and kind of symphonic way, like, oh, it turns out that she's the cousin of the man who, in that kind of way, which is not to denigrate it, but it's not my style as a thinker or a reader or a writer. I want things to be more open, and I wanted to think about cities and history and event and one person who kind of just moves through these landscapes, and for the registration of how they echo one another to take place in the mind of the reader and not so much directly on the page. So for me, it's just time too. You have a few years to figure these things out. So I'll work on one small part and then work on another small part. It's like moving tanks to the front lines or something, Like you can't get there in one day when you're moving provisions, to.
I'm liking this image of you as General Rommel.
But it is like that. But with the thing of like the image that I described about the blackouts in New York, the blackout in New York in '77, and this march in Italy, that was just my idea of these two crowd scenes and how they would cohere, and then it was a set of images around which some ideas revolved, and it resulted in this novel, basically. And then yesterday, I was at a rare book and manuscript library at Yale, the Beinecke Library, and there's a curator there who's collected every bit of ephemera from the autonomous movement in Italy that he could find. He's been to Italy several times. He's totally, his expertise is protest culture, so he tried to buy the papers of Guy Debord and almost bought them with the permission of Debord's widow, Alice Becker-Ho, but it was blocked by the French government, who suddenly realized that Debord was this national treasure and that his papers had to stay in France. I'm getting a little digressive, sorry. But he has collected all this stuff, and he put out all these papers for me to look at and give a kind of show and tell to this humanities working group there. And we all collected at the Beinecke Library, and we looked at all the papers, and on the end of one of the tables was this enormous broadsheet that these people in Italy had made of the blackout in New York City, and it had King Kong on top of the Empire State Building, and like all these epithets in Italian, kind of reveling in the criminality of this one night in New York. And I kept asking myself, is there any similarity between these two events? One is logical, theoretical, organized. It has to do with a nation that's not really a nation, and the history of the South versus the North, and factory culture, and et cetera. But then it was like all right there in this one image. So that felt really kind of vindicating, but out of Rivka's question of many years where you don't know exactly how two things are related.
I mean, when I was sort of digging around in the same kind of thing in the 70s political ephemera in London, and I went to the British Library and I was trying to find out that I figured they must have some kind of holding of at least the bigger publications. I mean, there were political magazines like Black Dwarf that were very important, and they had nothing, and what they had largely been stolen or just badly defaced, and it was, I mean, and it was really tragic that nobody was paying any attention to this, and I actually ended up having a lot more luck with eBay than I did with libraries at all, like, because you could, I mean, nobody wants to read tedious sectarian Maoist tracts from 1973, I mean, other than me, and so I ended up, and it was a great work displacement activity as well. So I'm actually working, but I'm really into this eBay auction. So yeah, I have a little collection that I've made myself. I should probably donate it to.
But that is work too, don't you think? I mean,
well, it is work, but it's not actually work that gets you paid.
But maybe you're doing something for the book, like you're giving glow or mystification to the lost.
There was something about handling these materials that felt important, and also there was something that was actually. I realized that I was betraying them in a certain way as well, because of course, kind of treating this stuff as a collector and a sort of fetishist, you're absolutely diffusing it of any of the kind of political importance that the authors hoped that they would have. And actually, I mean, so you're right. I mean, I'm being flip, but it was quite useful in thinking about what I was writing to understand my own impulses around the material.
Can I ask Hari a question? May I ask how you got interested in King Mob initially? I never really knew that.
So King Mob was I suppose a situationist international. An offshoot seems a little simplistic, but there were a bunch of people in West London around Notting Hill, late 60s, early 70s, who had contact with the SI, and they had contact with the up against the wall motherfucker people in here. And in fact, I think De Boer had them kicked out of the SI because they were involved with the motherfuckers. But there were these two brothers who were at the center of that. And actually, I suppose how I first knew about that was that there was a piece of graffiti that lasted, and from whenever they must have done it, sometime around 1970 until well into the 1990s, which was there was a huge long wall that ran up by the tube line as you were going towards Ladbroke Grove on the overland to stretch of this line, and it just said, "Get up, work, go to bed, go to the place." It was some sort of work, play, blah, blah, with no play
Like
in it.
the Nike advertisement.
Oh yeah, maybe. I wish I could actually call to mind the wording, because I'm not doing it very well. But anyway, there was this huge, the banality of the working day of the average person, and why. It said something like 1 in 10 go mad, 1 in 3 crack up. And I mean, as a kid, I would always wonder, like, kind of what's the difference between going mad and cracking up? It was just, but this thing lasted a weird amount of time, and it was part of my childhood life. And then to realize that these guys had done it, and it was part of this campaign that they had of writing slogans up. A lot of sort of secondhand Paris 68 slogans went up there, and then. More recently, I mean, as an adult, I fell into a sort of milieu in London where there were the sort of remnants of kind of SI-affiliated things and various kind of currents of utopian anarchism. There were these people called the Association of Autonomous Astronauts, who I used to know, and they had the very, it's the obvious idea. I mean, space travel is a state activity in its, actual form, and but space is the space of the imagination and possibility and so on. So they thought that space travel should be for all, and that we should basically start making a bottom-up plan to go to space. And so there were meetings and publications, and then people would give papers on how we might get to space and what we would do in space if we got into space. Would we have a rave? Would we have sex? What were the possibilities of space? And so there were all these people who were actually, they didn't realize it at the time, part of this tradition that went very, very directly back to King Mob and beyond. And so that was, before I knew what I was in the middle of, that's where I was.
Space to me is just something that's been invented by the military-industrial complex.
Speaking of the military-industrial complex, so if writing a novel is slowly moving the trucks towards the front line, what is writing a short story like? I assume you both don't write short stories, right? Have you ever written short stories? You do? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, in your novels, I mean, the chapters do feel like individual stories, but I was curious about Rivka's process, because you've written a novel and now you're writing short stories. So I wanted to know how the process is different.
I don't know. I mean, I like the trucks thing is nice, and I always forget avant-garde is a military term, which isn't an accident. Although it's always, you're always having to call up some enemies to make sure there's someone to meet you over on the other side. But I think the sort of the same analogy from the other side, and maybe something about short story writing puts you in a sort of like a smaller frame of mind is trying to. I think of it like you're trying to grow mushrooms, but you can't plant mushrooms, but you want to grow them. And so that's what it feels like to me a little bit, the short story process, where you know that if you came up with it, it can't be that good because it fits in your head. Like I always think you can only do like such sized math problem without some paper. Like everyone knows that. So you sort of know, like, if the whole thing fits in my head at one time, at one moment, it's like not going to be that good. So you hope like that it can be like sprout a little bit on paper, or with the help of time and paper and chance intersections, like chance interests or old interests that you didn't know you have, or old memories that pop up. So I think it's a lot like that. It involves a lot of waiting, because there's no seeds to plant. You just have to wait for some sort of spore to show up, and kind of think about what temperature might make the spore slightly more interested in landing. I don't know, but I'm not sure that's so different from a novel, or it wasn't for me. Yeah.
Well, it would seem that at some point you do have a sense of direction in a novel. And maybe in what you're describing seems to be the opposite. Like you
Maybe
distrust
it's
a sense of
momentum.
direction.
At some point in the novel, it's so big that the possible ways in which it's going to go keep shrinking. Like the first word, you've still got, unfortunately, like a bazillion words that might be the second word. But by the time you're on like the 35,000th word, there's maybe only 1 million words that might be the next word, because it just starts to contract, I think, a little bit, maybe.
It's a very melancholy part of writing a novel, isn't it? I mean, the beginning, you have almost infinite sense of how great this thing is going to be. And then it kind of narrows down to what you've actually done.
See, yeah, to me that there's like a horror in the infinite, that kind of freedom is just, I think freedom is in the law.
Does that mean that you have a blank? Have you ever had writer's block? Have you ever had a kind of confronting the blank page and?
I hear about
failing?
that a lot. The blank page. I don't know if I've ever had writer's block or not, but it's sort of like, am I neurotic or just a normal human being? It's just
Is there
one.
something wrong with me that I'm not neurotic enough? Is that what you're like worried?
But I think that it's more that when I start the book and there is infinite possibility, it's more challenging because there's this, you think you can just include everything, but you can't. And once I've narrowed down, I know what I'm doing, and so it's
sounded
much
like that's
more
what happened
pleasurable.
to you with Telex to Cuba, from what we were talking about in that Skype conversation. The amount of research you actually did was insane, wasn't it? You did years of I mean,
I
you
did.
kind of became Cuba.
Right. It was my first novel. It was a learning process, and I did a lot of research because it was a time and a place that I didn't know anything about. I was before I was born, and a place I'd never lived, and I felt like I had to metabolize the whole long Baroque history of Cuban politics leading up and through the revolution in order to write the book. Now I don't do things that way anymore. I didn't do any research for my new book because I was writing about realms that I felt I had some kind of handle on, which was the reason why I chose to move toward them. But there was still a kind of full array of possibilities, of how you get. For me, it's like I get an idea. There's a set of things that could happen, and then as I start to write, it's the narrative itself that closes down the other possibilities. But the closing down, for me, is very reassuring, because once I'm on a specific track and I know who the characters are and what kinds of things I want to happen, I just have a much better handle on what I'm doing, and I want to get to a point where I'm writing sentences that can reassure the reader that they're in good hands. Until I'm to that point, I'm just not sure, because things could open out, and I want the novel to be not arbitrary. I think that's the thing. And as a reader, I don't like it when I'm reading something and I encounter something that seems arbitrary to me in the book.
Yeah.
So that's my fantasy, is to create a work that doesn't have any arbitrary components to it.
I have a problem as a reader with certain sorts of absurdism and postmodernism, where you realise that there is, the next thing could be completely arbitrary, and my interest drains away at that point. Even as if in a sort of abstract intellectual way, I admire whatever structure is being proposed. I kind of would rather do something else.
Yeah, you want that mix where it feels like a surprise, hopefully a surprise even to the writer, and inevitable. Like, they were surprised, but there could have been nothing else would have been somehow, almost like a lot. You want a logic, even if you want the logic to have been complicated enough that you couldn't just see through to the end of it, in which case you don't really need it. You've just already set it up. You think, oh, well, then you just follow this logic. I don't actually have to read the rest of it. But if the logic keeps, I mean, that's that Alice in Wonderland thing where you sort of think, every sort of turn seems very unexpected and absolutely logical. Like it couldn't have been something else.
This reminds me of something that Cesar Aira talks about his, when he describes his writing process. He is open to the arbitrary.
Wait, who did you say?
Cesar Aira, the
He
Argentinian
just goes forward
writer.
and he doesn't edit, though, doesn't he?
So
I mean,
he
just-
goes forward and he's open to arbitrary occurrences. Anything random is likely to be included in the novel or incorporated, but the way he goes is he can only justify it as he goes forward. So the reader's experience won't be as if they're encountering something arbitrary because it has been justified, but it just hasn't been justified retroactively. It only happens forward. Now, but there's something in that description that, after having this conversation with you, I realize is maybe not so believable because at some point he needs to stop, otherwise it would never end. So at some point that process...
He's way more productive than anyone sitting up here,
Yes,
right?
it's true. I mean,
But
he's
I
written like
also-
100 books, if not
But
more.
I also think he's describing a methodology and not a product. Like he's written like almost 100 books, and some of them are amazing, and some of them are slightly less amazing. But I feel like that's a methodology, sort of like jazz, right? That's the jazz methodology where there is a sort of deep logic running through it. And it is a logic it's a methodology that's sort of using the sort of fuel of chance in order to push itself. So like I think in a sense the product is not arbitrary because the method is so rigorous.
I mean, it's not totally dissimilar to Raymond Roussel making that sort of methodology out of puns and then forcing the story on through that.
It's like also like those painters, it's sort of an old-fashioned abex modality where they say, I just throw something up on the canvas and then I respond. And then I put something up else on the canvas and I respond to that. And I'm not belittling that.
Right.
But there's so many different ways of making a painting, right? But it's the end product really that matters. But yeah, that kind of process, I think... I mean, you can bring the same process to every single painting and end up with different results in that way. But
Do you see the Gutai show at the Guggenheim?
I haven't seen it, no.
It's really good. I've just been there today, and it's exactly where they're attempting not to control the materials. So one guy's painting with his feet because he has less control, and people are using drips and responding in various ways to the kind of odd materials that they're using that they can only kind of nudge rather than actually kind of completely control top down.
Although your voice imitation was good. I totally saw the painter.
Right. You're ventriloquizing an abex painter. Some people refer to that also as ventriloquism in a way. It's like this actual dialogue with the material. So it's you're throwing your voice onto this thing that you're creating, and it speaks back to you and tells you what it needs. Anyway, we don't no comment.
That's like when
necessary.
writers say that thing in interviews about, oh, my characters just started talking, or they had this life, and I was just.
Bullshit.
That's such nonsense, isn't it? Let's just
I
call
agree.
time on that particular lie that writers tell.
Agreed. True. I wonder if it's time to ask. Do you have other questions for each other, or should we open the discussion to the audience? I had one question that you may choose to answer or not, but I wanted to. I mean, you're also engaged with world literature as well, and so I wanted to just get a sense of what your engagement with it is, what it does for you, how you see it as being different and distinct from American fiction, and what it brings to the table for you. It's a huge question.
I'm really into ethnic food and world literature. I love both of those things.
True. I'm thinking of your
kidding.
essay on Clarice Lispector, for instance,
Yeah, no,
who's hardly a household name.
I didn't mean to jump into this first. I just had to make that one crack. And Rivka and Hari, I can't wait to hear their answers because they are both people who read widely and write about other writers well beyond the United States. I've always been interested in literature, not kind of for any like ethical or ideological reason, that it's literature and translation, and that phrase kind of gets bandied around as though, well, I'm a literature and translation person. But it's, for me, just somehow a fact that a lot of writers that I've always read are people who are not American. I'm not quite sure why that is. I mean, I like a lot of French writers, but in terms of like Lispector or people even less well known than she is known, it may have something to do with exposure that I had relatively early. When I was finishing at Columbia, I first moved to New York. I worked at Grand Street magazine, which they just published so many interesting writers that I learned about through working there. It was, Jean Stein had great taste, but she also just listened to a lot of other people, like Barbara Epler from New Directions, and all these people would call her and recommend things, and they were the first people to publish Bolaño in English. So I got exposed to all this stuff that I thought was really cool and interesting, and I guess that's just my taste. And with Lispector, I got asked to review all the new translations of her books. There were 5 that came out in the last year, and I just thought, I just finished my novel, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to be a completist on one writer, because I'm not that way. I have friends who read, everything by so-and-so, and I'm more of a dabbler than a completist. But in this case, she's such a uniquely dense and kind of a strange writer that I thought it would be really cool to just totally immerse myself in her work and then try to say something about it. But that work is very intense. I don't know, I gave a bunch of the books to a friend of mine who wanted to read them at the same time as I did, and then she wrote me an email. We don't live in the same city, and she said, okay, I've finished them all, and I feel like I just ate a 15-course meal of highly buttered snails. There's like a richness or strangeness and heaviness to that material, but I revere it, and I was very happy to be able to write that piece.
Did you work on the Americas issues at BOM?
Yes, I did.
You did. So that exposed you to
Oh,
Latin American
absolutely.
literature as well.
Yeah.
Mhm. What about the rest?
I think right now I'd quite like to be a Spanish writer. And I just discovered, actually, it's my shame I haven't read the Via Matas thing in that edition of BOM, but I just read Montano's Malady, and that's a very good novel. And I've been reading, I was talking to somebody before we started about Javier Marias, and he's playing havoc with my own writing at the moment because he's got such a peculiar style, and I keep just doing Marius at the moment badly, so I'm having to process that. I don't know. In general, I'm always embarrassed by how little British fiction, contemporary British fiction, I want to read, and actually Indian fiction as well, because people assume that I'll have this very strong engagement with some sort of post-colonial idea of Indian fiction. I'm sort of Salman Rushdie's representative on Earth, and I kind of I actually sort of run screaming from a lot of that, partly because it's such a kind of constricting. It's a box that people tried to put me in earlier in my career, and I had to get out of by not talking about that stuff and talking about other things.
Do you pay a price for escaping that box in a way? Is there a compromise, or is there?
I think certain people would be happier if I just carried on writing books with elephants and in them, and the spice market, and.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's like an undercurrent of guilt. We all feel guilty about what we are or aren't interested in. Like, I feel like I was maybe 30 till I took an interest in any American writers, which I feel like is totally capricious and not appropriate, but that was the thing. For some reason, I assumed if it was in translation, it just seemed that much better. And if it was by someone from Japan, it seemed even better. And maybe if they were from Germany and and it's not actually true, but it's not necessarily something you need to resist. But I do remember it being like surprising to find out that Dennis Johnson and John Cheever were amazing writers. Like, of course they were, but because I knew they were, or knew that I was supposed to really get excited by them, they were like at the bottom of the bottom of the pile. And I got like accidentally in both cases, I got sort of accidentally tricked into reading them, as if because they wrote in English, they were not interesting.
My wife is also a novelist, Katie Kitamura. She has lately taken to saying that her ideal for her prose is to make it sound as if it's been translated out of something else into English.
Well, that's the dream of writing like Alexander Hemon. You just think, why is English my first language? Like, what a curse. Because it is a great constraint for every word to be off key a little bit.
But that sort of ambition to make language strange, which is clearly at the core of every artistic use of language, that's something to do with that, isn't it? Alexander Hemon clearly has that in a very direct way, in that those early stories before his English was absolutely spot on, he accidentally made it new, didn't he? And he had that. But there's something else. There's this kind of uncanny quality in a sort of unheimlich. There's a flatness that comes with a certain sort of tone that maybe a translated piece sometimes has, because there's something that's not there on the page that you're stretching towards, and that's quite an interesting tone in itself. That kind of gap between what's there and what. Possibly completely imagined hinterland to that language, and the flatter it is on the surface, the sort of weirder it is too, and that kind of uncanny I'm quite interested in at the moment.
Yeah. Can I say one more thing about that? I was just thinking, I think another reason I read a lot of writers who don't write originally in English, maybe everyone is this way, but it's like I sort of want to participate or educate myself under the spirit of a conversation that's old, and I hate to say it, but it's like taking place in Europe among, it's like it starts with Baudelaire, or even before him, like Chateaubriand, like these French writers, and then Benjamin takes them all up and kind of theorizes about them, and then, Sartre and Deleuze write beautifully about these people, and I don't know, like I love Francis Ponge, and there are all these French writers who are sort of part of a bigger conversation that's partly taking place not just between writers, but among their kind of critical and philosophical champions. And like, I'm interested to know what Lacan was reading, and he incorporates certain people into his lectures, and that to me is sort of like a rebus or a mysterious world. And I always want to read the people that you read about in these texts, or that they considered to be important. And I think maybe Lispector was one of those people, because she's sort of an undecodable writer. And so I sometimes follow those kinds of paths. And so it's, for me, like less about the language being translated than about these people being part of a kind of world that I imagine and want to learn more about and pursue.
There is a danger of a sort of straight nostalgia for the 20th century avant-garde, though, isn't there? There's somehow things don't happen like that anymore, and to attempt to strike the sort of Baudelarian posture that kind of seemed to just about make it through the war, the Second World War, and kind of die somewhere in the early 70s. Like it feels fake when you put that on, and that.
Do you mean try to like adopt the modernist project, or?
No, I know. I mean, modern. I think modernism still is actually quite important still.
Me too.
But there's a lot of sort of avant-garde posturing that goes on, and it's not functional now. And I'm interested in that feeling of belatedness that a lot of especially white male writers, I think kind of adopt of a sort of nostalgia for a time when everything was, the stakes were higher and we were listened to and everybody was in the cafe, and that kind of thing is there's something dead about that to me, and that's not the same as saying let's abandon modernism, because I think I think there's something very urgent about the utopian currents of modernism in particular right now, and it seems that the culture is trying to close those currents down, and that's why, because they are subversive and they are still potentially disruptive and dangerous.
I think I agree with you. I wasn't really talking, or I didn't mean to invoke like one group of people sitting in a cafe together championing each other's work.
Sorry, I wasn't accusing you of being that person, but
But I meant more like people who take up one another's work, even across time. Like I wasn't really that interested in Fitzgerald and Malcolm Lowry until I read Deleuze's essay about those two writers, and I just like thinking about the way that people kind of traverse the cultural imaginary, writers, into other realms, and then I re-encounter them there and want to read them. So it's not like I'm not reading about them by a writer who is necessarily their contemporary. I don't know if that.
I also wonder what the role of pop culture there is. Like, is the dichotomy engage with modernism in a larger conversation, or engage in this also very nostalgic obsession with American pop culture? Maybe it's too reduction.
There's a particular sort of British position with regard to that, which is, there's a sort of generation older than me who grew up in the particularly sort of grey austerity post-war, and we're looking at kind of cars with fins and movie stars and seeing America as a kind of magical world of consumer promise. I think people like Martin Amis are absolutely enslaved to a kind of notion of America as bigger and more colourful. And now with the globalization of pop culture, that doesn't function in the same way. But when I, in the sort of 80s and 90s in London, there was this big thing about there was a publication whose name I forget, and their motto was high culture for, they treat high culture for low brows, or low culture for high brows, something like that. So they would write long kind of essays about Baudrillard and Schwarzenegger, and that was a very cool thing to do at that particular moment. And the kind of the irony took over everything, and no one was allowed to be serious about anything. And now look at the fucking mess we're in.
I feel like maybe what it is or one thing is that it's just the instinct. I think it's a writerly instinct, and maybe just a thinking instinct to be out of place. So you want to displace yourself. So maybe you're displacing yourself in time or geography or whatever it is, because there's some instinct that you think, when I'm comfortable and I know what's going on, I'm pretty stupid. And then when I'm uncomfortable and I'm aware that I'm not really keyed in and I'm not the expert, and then maybe I'm in a better position. So I sort of feel like the choice of going here or there, and the mistake of sometimes going somewhere else where you should be out of place, but actually feeling like you fit right into the cafe and you just miss your moment in time, whatever it is. You can always still mess everything up, but I think it's just that instinct to try and mess it up a little less by being discommoded in some way.
I totally agree with what you said. It's so smart. Part of being a writer is like looking for this way in which, you're entering some new realm or have to navigate it or something. I've never really written any pop culture into fiction, but I want to now.
And I'm like really excited that I know nothing about Tebow. And I'm like, I bet there's something really interesting there. Where
did you say TiVo or Tebow?
Well, Tebow.
The
I'm
kneeling
probably
down
wrong,
dude.
but it's like one
What's
of those things that I
Tebow?
realize.
Yeah, what is it?
Oh, he's some guy. He's an athlete.
He like
If I was
totally
in
kneeled
any
down in
other
some like
room,
green outdoor space.
Everyone would know who he was. All I know is he was in the paper. I'm just saying, like, those big pop cultural things that are both like super interesting or not interesting at all. It's like if you know nothing about Justin Bieber, there's actually probably something really interesting to find out.
I think there's a lot to be done with pop culture. Like, I wanted to write a novel about about a female version of Riff Raff. And and then James Franco played him in Spring Breakers, and I didn't feel scooped exactly, even if they took my idea. But I had it after the movie was made, so there's no accusation there. But when I saw that movie, I mean, there's many things to say about that film that we don't have to say here tonight. But when I saw that film, I felt like, wow, like a transcendent and amazing. Lyrical, almost like a kind of biblical treatment of like what's considered to be very low American pop culture. It really blew my mind, and so I saw more possibility for myself with using hot bodies in Florida. Just kidding.
Okay, so we have time for 3 questions from the audience. Yes?
I happen to have seen it, I think, I use the microphone, great. I happen to have seen in a couple reviews where you mentioned in your novel, which I haven't read, but I gather this is in it, the motherfuckers, who I take to be an evocation of Against Them All motherfuckers, who were a real radical group on the Lower East Side, and them referred to as a fictional radical group. And I wonder, in light of that, if you have
Someone else referred to them that way, reviewer, and I don't have control over what they write.
as fictional, yes. And I understood them to be your reference to a real radical group that was originally called Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers. And I wonder if, in light of that, in the cultural resistance to radicalism and sort of the cultural ignorance of history, if you have sort of any anxiety writing a book that deals in part with radical history and artists who are engaged in art that participates in radical theories into a culture that's so ignorant of it, that would misidentify a real radical group as a fictional or as something that you invented. And I wonder if that was something that you have thought about since the novel has been published.
Wait, did you ask if I encountered resistance?
No, I meant I wonder if you had anxiety since publishing the book, or even maybe before writing the book, if you thought about that, because people really know very, very little about radical culture in the United States.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, yes, I have thought about it. I mean, the one example that you give was, a review that was maybe the only review that wasn't completely positive. But it doesn't matter. But it's true. The person said a fictional group, and I just thought, well, that it's just like a 5-minute Google. But that's okay. I'm not really here to critique reviewers or anything, and I don't know.
Go on.
But I mean, maybe
Review your reviews.
Yeah. I don't know if maybe you bring it up because you wonder if it's emblematic or a symptom of a certain cultural ignorance or something. But I mean, I don't want to defend that writer, but in general, I don't know how many people know about Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker, and I don't necessarily expect them to. I mean, one of the great things about being a writer is that you get to have a set of readers that don't come from your same outlook, and they don't know the things that you know, and maybe they know things that I don't know. And once the book is an object in the world, it's their projection screen, and they can look into it and read from it and glean what they want to. Obviously, there was a real group. My group in the book is fictional, but they were inspired by the real group. And when I learned about the motherfuckers, I just thought that they were too good to pass up. And the way that, I won't go on too much about that, but I thought that they were an interesting group in a kind of potent moment on the Lower East Side. And in terms of how, leftist history is, how it's received or what's known about it, my job is to be a novelist and use what I think is interesting. And maybe people who didn't think they were interested in that history, but have recently become more politicized, will, be less opposed to it through reading the book or something. I don't know.
Any more questions? Here.
I always have a question. What was the first book or one of the first books you bought at the Strand and why? All three.
Well, I haven't lived in New York that long, so it would have been about 5 years ago, and I think it might have been a collection of Mark Twain's writings about the West, all his kind of Nevada silver mining things. There's some library of Western reprints that I think they had a whole shelf of downstairs at the time. Quite nice little hardcover volumes.
I don't think this is very telling, but I do remember it was Tatiana Tolstoya, which I just browsed on the shelf and thought Tolstoy had a granddaughter and poor thing tried to write. Like I just almost had a pity. I was like, I'm gonna listen.
I have no idea what the first book I bought at the Strand was. It would have been so many years ago, but I guess I'll just say instead that maybe in 1998 or something, I was walking down the street and ducked into the Strand, and there was a pile of William Eggleston's The Democratic Forest. And this is like way before he had his retrospective at MoMA or anything like that. And that book was long out of print, and they were first edition copies of it that had been mispriced. And they were $8.99 a piece, and so I bought all of them. There were only 8 of them, and then I gave them out to people every year for like special occasions. So 8 copies of The Democratic Forest.
I think that's really noble that you didn't sell them on eBay.
Oh, I thought you were going to be sarcastic and say it's really noble that you didn't tell them that they'd mispriced it. But, yeah, no, that didn't even occur to me. But, value is strange like that. Like, you can be really excited about having something that's worth a lot, but then you would never dare sell it. And so the monetization of it is almost meaningless, and yet it retains this, but it could be expensive.
Well, I didn't want to ask this, but no one was jumping to raise their hand. But I guess you guys spoke about world literature and being interested in translation for various reasons, including like just how the English comes off when it is translated. And I guess I was wondering about your interest in those world literature figures, if it also motivated in you a kind of an urge to learn different languages and read them in their original language. And like I guess also the question is like, is there also something you distrust about the translation that would force you to like try to get it in its original form?
Yeah, I have this fantasy life where I think I speak about 15 languages. And yeah, clearly translate. When you actually kind of compare translations to originals, you realize what a mess the whole thing is. I don't speak any Indian language. I speak a very tiny smattering of Hindi, but there's a whole tradition of Hindi and Urdu poetry that I would love to have access to, and so I've been attempting to kind of. I've been seeing what translations are out there. There's a poet called Kabir, 16th century, sort of ecstatic mystic poet. And he was a Sufi, but he kind of he has a lot of relevance for contemporary India because he talks about religious problems between Hindus and Muslims, and people have recently brought him up as in kind of contemporary political context. He's a very interesting poet, and the only translations of these sort of dreadful kind of inkhorn 19th century things like Tagore. If anyone's ever tried reading Tagore in English translation, it just seems inexplicable why this man is the national poet of anywhere. But yeah, and with no original, I've put several of these translations of Kabir side by side and tried to make an English poem that I thought read well. And that's quite, I mean, that I have no authority to do that, and I have no authority for my choices and that, other than just what I think it ought to say. It's quite a nice exercise, actually.
Gee, thank God for translators. Yeah, I'm not really a polyglot. I can read Italian and a little bit of Spanish, and I do read some things in Italian. But I only do that by necessity if they don't exist in English. And I wish I could read French, but I didn't study it growing up, and it feels like it's too late now. But maybe it sounds silly to say, but I think I can tell when I'm reading a good translation. Like, there's certain problems of translation that you can recognize, even if you're not looking at the original. And, we have this literature like that was written in ancient Greek that's still being retranslated today. Like, depending on who's translated Sappho's fragment, this is 31, the really famous one, it's a completely different poem. And so I think it's okay to re-encounter literature from different sides by different translators, and it can become an object of its own as a transmutated form into the new language. But with these things like, Flaubert's Madame Bovary and the volumes of Proust, I think you're getting a pretty good version when you read a translation by, a really respected person. But I admire translators a great deal, like Richard Howard, thank God for him, all these people who become not just the interlocutor for the original writer, but the champion of that person, because they know what to select and to bring that body of work into English.
I agree. I wish I spoke every language and could read it in the original, but even if you could read it in the original, I imagine there's some books where the translation is also really good. I mean, I feel like there are translators like that, like Susan Bernofsky, who I think is an amazing translator, and Michael Hoffman is an amazing translator. So good that maybe I'm being overexcited, but I'm like, even if I could read the original language, I might still be interested in it. But I basically think you're right. It just sort of sucks and makes you realize you're missing a lot. But at least it's not like in English where you think you're not missing a lot and you still are. So it's like a little plus.
Wait, but don't you read German?
No, I don't read. The only thing I can really read is Spanish. No. That's why I trust Susan Bernofsky and Michael Hoffman. Not for bringing me like the real Kafka, but for bringing me something that's really good.
I don't know why I thought you read German. I had read some interview with you where you recommended a book by an obscure German author, and it seemed like it hadn't been translated.
I read obscure German authors.
And at the time, I projected onto you, and I was, of course, like that smart and talented and cute Rivka Galchen also reads German.
Actually, I take that back. I do read German.
I'll just say something very, very brief about translation. In a way, what's really beautiful about it, as Rachel and everybody has been saying, is that, when you have classics in their original language, at some point, you just stop reading them. You read them once, you don't need to go back to reading them. You might be aware of the fact that right now there's like a big celebration of Lorca's Poets in New York. There's an exhibition at the New York Public Library and a host of events taking place all over the city. And so someone asked, why Lorca now? And are people reading him in Spain? And the response to that was, people are not nearly as excited. And the fact that every couple years or every 5 years, every decade, there's a new translation of Lorca in English becomes a major event. So there's reasons to go back to the work and rediscover things that had been missed originally because of perhaps a different translation or, mistakes. Every single translation is going to be inferior to the original if that's how you choose to look at translation. There's many other ways to look at them. They're always beautiful things, even if they fail. But that occasion to revisit a classic and reread it every so often because there's a new translation is something that you don't get in the original language. And Yeah, that's all I want to say. So I think, do you have anything else that you would like to share with the audience, or are we're essentially done? Rachel?
Happy May Day.
Happy May Day, yes. Let's not forget.
Thank you